just a reminder, when you're measuring socioeconomic status, or as sociologists, when we're looking at socioeconomic status, we look at income, we look at occupational prestige, and we look at education. So education attainment is total years of formal education. Education is one of the strongest predictors of occupation, income, and wealth later in life. As the economy in industrialized societies have shifted in favor of computer and information-based economy, a college education has risen in value. College educated individuals are better able to compete in the marketplace of jobs. Although the education gap between black and whites continued to close, racial differences still persist. Occupation is one of the most important determinants of one's social class position. One's education influences one's occupation, and one's occupation influences one's income and wealth. You receive an income for the work you perform, and some employers assist in the accumulation of wealth by providing benefits such as retirement plans or stock options. A lot of times we see that in larger companies will tend to provide those other aspects. That's also considered a part of fringe benefits too. So now we'll look at and discuss some of the characteristics of different social classes. Most sociologists describe the class system in the U.S. as divided into several classes. You have the upper elites, who own majority of the corporation and personal wealth, a very small proportion of people who exercise enormous control in society. Only a small percentage of upper elites are among the super rich in the United States. The upper class usually owns more than one piece of real estate. They can afford to send their children to private schools, colleges, and universities. And even when we think about private schools, they're typically going to be schools that, because a lot of people can send their kids to private schools, but these schools are going to be the ones that tend to be very expensive, smaller schools. Sometimes it could be boarding schools, but they're the ones that basically filter these kids into like the Ivy Leagues. Okay. Um, they usually drive expensive cars and regularly go on expensive vacations. The upper class enjoys connections to many upper class persons through high prestige occupations, memberships in clubs and charities, participation in political life, and other such activities. So normally this upper class, once again, tends to be very small. So they tend to kind of mix and mingle with each other. And the other thing too is, if we think about the terms of Weber's life chances, we can see that this upper elite class has a lot of resources. Thus, there's a lot of opportunities or a lot of life chances for persons that are born within this upper elite class. A lot of people identify, and most people in the U.S. tend to identify themselves as the middle class in the United States. Even those with wealth and income put themselves in though that may put them in the upper class, they may also see themselves as the middle class. And in the next slide, we're going to show the breakdown of the middle class too. But when we think about the fact that people can self-identify, this is one of the reasons why the boundaries of social class within the U.S. is very fluid. There's not concrete, we don't have these concrete measurable criteria that place people into certain positions. We can say that we do, but I could easily identify as being part of the middle class. Even though most people identify as being part of the middle class, we're really more within the working class. And in fact, Marx talks about that with his class consciousness, and he says that people may identify with a certain class that's not going to be in their best interest. Okay. And he talks about until we start to identify or develop this class consciousness, we will still have this false consciousness as belonging to a class that doesn't benefit us. Okay. The middle class is a catch-all for diverse groups of occupations, lifestyles, and people who earn stable incomes at a primarily white-collar jobs, but also lower managerial occupations. I would even say within this group too, you may see persons who may have been traditionally identified as blue-collar workers, but because of the income that they're receiving, they may also identify within the middle class. So even within that, we can see the upper middle class household income ranges from about 100,000 to 180,000, while lower middle class house incomes range from about 38,000 to 100,000. So we can kind of see this overlap. But when we look at this one, on this next slide, we can see that the upper middle class are those who have high income and high prestige and tend to be well-educated professionals or business execs. Upper middle class households, once again, their ranges can be anywhere from 180 to 100,000, but they don't consider themselves part of the upper elite class. They are typically at the top section of the middle class, and this is going to be about 15% of American households. Members are likely college educated, and they typically have advanced degrees beyond the undergraduate degree. The average middle, they maybe work less prestigious white-collar jobs such as bank branch managers, government office workers, and their income can be anywhere from 48,000 to about 112. Once again, we can see that overlaps between the upper middle class and the average middle. Sometimes I say middle. Okay. Normally, these persons may have a college degree. Some of them have some type of college, and they do have goals where they do want all of their kids to go and attend college. Okay. The lower middle class, these persons normally work in skilled trades or lower income bureaucrat workers, also kind of known as the working class. The lower middle are trained office workers. They may be like nurses, sales people, police officers, firefighters, and others who provide skilled services. This can include about 40% of American households. Most are varied in the social class strata. They may include college educated persons and persons with high school diploma. Households that fall within a working class, normally it's about 20%, and their income range is about 20,000 to 38,000. Both household members typically are working, primary blue collar workers such as mechanics or pink collar workers such as clerical aides. Family income is enough to pay for the rent or mortgage, to put food on the table, and perhaps save for a summer vacation. The working class includes factory workers, mechanics, office workers, sales clerks, restaurant and hotel workers, and others who earn modest weekly paychecks at jobs that involve little control over the size of their income or working conditions. Now, when I talk about the urban underclass, I'm also going to include when I talk about the urban underclass, I'm also going to include those that fall within a lower socioeconomic class or lower class. The lower class is going to be about 20% of American households. This includes some full-time wage workers and those who work part-time or not at all. The annual income is going to be typically lower than $20,000. The urban underclass in the United States refers to those who didn't make it to the lower class of society. This tends to be the new urban poor, those who live in the poorest city neighborhoods and often fall under the radar. They may be homeless, unskilled, and unemployed men, young single mothers and their children on welfare, and teens from welfare-dependent families. This class has actually, Julius Wilson, he is the one who actually kind of looked at this and kind of coined that term with the urban underclass. One of the things we can see with this is that at one particular time within this inner city, there used to be factories, and so people had jobs, and those jobs did not really require a lot of skills, or you could get on-the-job training. We've seen where that's definitely changed. One of the models that they've used was Detroit, and back in the day, like in the early 1900s, Detroit, the automobile plants basically were able to house 40,000 people, employ 40,000 people. They had enough employees to sustain a department store, 2 schools, grocery store on its premises. When the plant started closing, like in 1957, they started laying off workers. By 1967, the car companies had restructured their operations, relocating the plants to the suburbs and automating production facilities. So what happened to those who worked at the stores and worked at the schools? A lot of things that happened is they became part of this urban underclass if they could not afford to move out to the suburbs, or if they could not afford, or if it was very difficult for them to find another job. Now, a lot of times when we think about the urban underclass, or when we think about people that are living in poverty, we tend to think about those that are we tend to focus on those in the inner city. However, there was research that was done by Rachel Jones, and one of the things that she found was that the suburban poor outnumbered the urban poor by 1.2 million. Many of the suburban poor were pushed out of the cities when the factories closed and other business closing, headed to the suburbs in search for jobs and low-cost housing. The other thing too is that O'Hara and Johnson, they not only looked at poverty too, but they also looked at those that were in rural areas. And they found or estimated that about 2.6 million rural children could be classified as underclass. The rural poor have also felt the effects of the economic restructuring, the declining in farming, mining, and timber industries, and the transfer of routine manufacturing jobs out of the U.S. So it's important for us to realize that part of this underclass is not just those from the inner city. Class conflict theory sees class not as a continuum, but as a relationship of exploitation and domination in which class is defined by the relationship of classes to larger systems of economic production. The middle class or the professional managerial class is caught in a contradictory position between elites and the working class because they have some control over others, but little control over the economic system. Although not to an extent that Marx predicted, class have become more polarized and the poor under assault in a system of inequality. Class consciousness is the perception that a class structure exists along the feeling of a shared identification with others in one's class. So for Marx, that was one of the biggest things that he talked about, is the fact that you needed to have this class consciousness where people would recognize that they're all part of the same class. And for him, that would be the proletariats, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. Okay, so it's the idea too with this class consciousness that you share the same life chances. The faith that upward mobility is possible ironically perpetrates inequality. Class inequality in any society is usually found in the foundation ideas that support or actively promote inequality. Class consciousness was higher in the U.S. during the labor movements of the 1920s and 1930s. And that was because people started to recognize that they were part of a lower socioeconomic class and pushed for better conditions. False consciousness remembers this idea to the extent which the subordinate classes have internalized the view of the dominant class. And that's the idea that a lot of people view themselves as being part of the middle class, when in reality, they're part of the working class, or as Marx would call it, the proletariats. So, Karl Marx argued that the driving force in society was economics. According to Marx, divisions in society stems from one's relationship to the means of production, the means whereby the production of material goods is carried on in a society. Remember, the means of production is going to be whatever is in that industry, what's going on, okay, or what industry is supporting that society. And one of the things that Marx says is that persons who are part of the bourgeoisie, that would be like the upper elite class for us, they would be the owners of the means of production. So they would own or have ownership within the interest of society. The proletariats are going to be those that are part of the working class or the laborers. These are the ones who sell their labor for wages. This is going to be the group that's exploited. He also talks about the petty bourgeoisies, and for us, we would identify them more as the middle class. There would be small business owners. And so for Marx, when he wrote his Communist Manifesto, one of the things he talked about was the fact that this group would come to recognize that they're part of the labor class. And in order for society to be fair, they would have to basically have a revolution to flip things where they now became the owners of that industry. He said that the petty bourgeoisies would start to recognize themselves as proletariats, because one of the things that would happen is that you would realize that these people, the bourgeoisies, are getting richer. These people are actually becoming poor or falling within this proletariat area. You'll see a little bit of this when you watch the video about how wealth is distributed, and you'll see how the middle class is kind of losing gain. And that's kind of one of the things that Marx would talk about. He does describe this other group called the lumpen proletariats, but he says that they are the jobless. So for him, they really wouldn't serve a purpose within the revolution. Is kind of what he talks about. Okay. One of the things that's important for us to understand too is that Marx lived in the 19th century, a time where there was a small number of industrialists. And if we think about within the United States, it was Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. And so for him, it was the fact that he would see these groups getting wealthier, the small percentage getting wealthier, while the rest of society was getting poor. So that's one of the reasons why he would talk about this inequality. Okay. And for him, it wouldn't be until everyone that fell within this group developed a class consciousness and recognized that they were actually part of the working class and that they were being exploited.